At the beginning of last month, Apple announced revenue for the second quarter ended April 1st of $52.9 billion. Their first quarter was an all-time record, $78.4 billion, all of which makes their shareholders very happy. But Brian Merchant and Dajian Zheng can tell you a little about where Apple's products come from. We'll meet Dajian later in the program. He worked at one of those factories to experience life firsthand. But first tonight, Brian Merchant, whose book, The One Device, The Secret History of the iPhone, published by Bantam Press, goes inside Foxconn's Longhua factory on the outskirts of the Chinese city Shenzhen. Foxconn is a major manufacturer of Apple products, and at its height, this factory was home to an estimated 450,000 workers. It's way larger than the population of Wellington. Most of them working migrants from elsewhere in China. They worked, and in 2010 they began committing suicide or threatening to commit suicide as a kind of industrial action against the conditions there. It received global media coverage, but Foxconn and Apple said the issues had been addressed. So Brian Merchant got smuggled in to see what life was like at the Foxconn factory, and he found it was still dispiritingly, depressingly grim.
I mean, to me, that was the most difficult thing to hear. Over here in the States, at least, back when the news of the suicide epidemic broke back in 2010 or so, it was a brief media sensation, and Apple came out and made these statements about how they were all over it, they were looking into it, they were going to fix it. So to find out 7 years later, firsthand, talking to these workers who make this device possible. Every single smartphone, iPhone that we have in our hands is made by hand by people who are working under these conditions. That, it turns out, by and large, have not improved significantly since that outrage. And they said so themselves. They said, the media coverage for a while drove improvement. They saw a small wage increase. They saw some, benefits and protections temporarily instated, but by and large, the dominant factors, the drivers that were really sort of causing all the misery are still in place. This really sort of oppressive management style where if you make a mistake after, throughout at any point during your 12-hour workday, standing on your feet, doing this repetitive task over and over, hundreds of phones cycling through your station, and if you mess something up, it's a good possibility that your supervisor will have you stand up at the end of the day and they will publicly shame you for making this mistake. It's an incredible amount of pressure by people who on people who have traveled great distances, who are away from home, to sort of psychologically process this. And a lot of them still cannot. We don't see the same numbers as before, sort of when the headlines were made, but the truth is it just remains a real issue and a real tragedy that there are any suicides at all in these sort of corporate-controlled factory city-states.
I'm quoting you to you. When I look back at the photos I snapped, I can't find one that has someone smiling in it.
Yeah, and I can't remember anyone smiling either. Which is sort of remarkable given the size and the scale and how many people we did pass. And, we weren't perhaps, the most ardent, documenters of the scene because we were so concerned at first, at least, with, getting caught and making sure that that we were okay. But yeah, just all the hordes of people. This place is all around work. Everything is focused on work. Everything caters to this extreme work ethic. And, it's not just work maybe as we conceive of it. It's relentless, repetitive, nonstop, full days worth of work. And I couldn't help but sense that it was a deeply unpleasant thing. It wasn't surprising that most people only last a year there. It's designed with one thing in mind, and that's maximum efficiency and squeezing out as many products with the lowest bottom line as possible from this skilled workforce. So it's I guess it's perhaps unsurprising that this is the sort of place that you end up with.
Can we extrapolate out, and I'm not sure I'm going to ask this question terribly well, but if you look at Apple's rhetoric, if you look at the kind of pioneering, inspirational vision of its founders, if you look at the stories attached to it, if you look at the products and how sophisticated and attractive and appealing they are, is this kind of labour such a profound paradox that at some level it's almost grotesque?
It's certainly, at the very least, deeply problematic. I think the best way to explain the differences in the rhetoric and reality is the fact that that rhetoric and that sort of talk sort of exists in a vacuum. And I don't think, Steve Jobs really was ever all that concerned with the well-being of these factory workers. He may have made a brief statement or two, but he was fairly glib about how he described it. He's like, we're all over that. The suicide rate is actually higher in mainland China, so it's really nothing to worry about. But I don't think he really ever gave too deep a thought to the fact that he was, in a sense, responsible for the well-being of these people. His work orders were animating the entire operation at the time. Apple, contracts Foxconn, sure, but Foxconn sort of lives and dies at Apple's whim, especially then when it was almost completely reliant on Apple's business. It's more diverse now, but the fact is that they are two, or Apple would at least, prefer that they remain perceived as two discrete realities, two separate realities. And I think one of the great projects that we need to undertake, both as citizens of the world and consumers, is sort of integrating into our vision of these products that we use the reality that they are forged by human labor, and oftentimes, deeply unpleasant and brutal human labor. So I think we need to sort of, do more to push Apple to do more, I guess is one way of putting it. Apple will be content to separate these stories and to ignore the stories as long as it's convenient to do so.
That's Brian Merchant. His book is The One Device.